Hey everybody, it's me, the Lit Teacher, and today we're going to do a deep dive on Tennessee Williams. I'm going to give you a bit of a biography of his life story, and this is hopefully going to help you write more convincingly about his plays. For example, A Streetcar Named Desire, which you are probably studying in IGCSE Literature and English right now. So let's get into who the guy who wrote this play was. Let's talk about his life. I'm going to start with his birth. I'm going to run right through to his death. And then at the end, I'm going to tell you why any of this matters. In other words, how can you apply some of what you're going to learn in this video in an exam context and kind of use it to write more effectively about his plays like A Streetcar Named Desire. So let's get into his early life. Well, Tennessee Williams was born in the American South, place where he set many of his plays, in 1911, a place called Mississippi. And yeah, his life was pretty tumultuous from start to end. And yeah, it was especially tumultuous as a child. In fact, he nearly died of this thing called diphtheria. And this would have some pretty significant repercussions for him growing up. He was a very sick, a very weak child. And this kind of caused some issues between him and his father as well. Now, Tennessee Williams' father, from what we understand, was just generally not a nice person. He was super religious to the point of it being kind of problematic, quite fervent. He was alcoholic and he was abusive towards Tennessee and his extended family. And the diphtheria thing, which caused Tennessee to be a kind of weak and sickly child, meant that Tennessee Williams's father didn't really kind of feel that he got the son that he wanted. He saw him as weak, and he also saw him as being effeminate, not like, I guess, other boys at the time. And potentially part of the reason for this is the fact that Tennessee Williams was gay, and probably this was pretty apparent as a child to his father. And his father, being the kind of religious guy that he was, obviously did not approve of maybe what his son was. Now, because of all this kind of trauma and tumultuousness in his childhood, you can probably imagine where Tennessee Williams went. He went into books, into the escape that literature can offer. And this is a pretty common thing we hear in a lot of writers' careers. And through reading and developing this love of literature, he developed a love of writing, and this would obviously lead to him pursuing a career in writing. And thank goodness he did, because, yeah, he gave us some masterpieces. So we'll talk now a little bit about his education. Well, he went and he studied journalism, which is probably what you're going to study as a writer if you're kind of hoping there'll be a job at the end of it for you. Going and studying creative writing is kind of a risky thing. It's not easy to break into this kind of field as a career pathway. So journalism would have been seen as a viable option for Tennessee, and possibly also maybe helped him convince his father that, yeah, I want to go study writing, Dad, but don't worry, I'm going to be a journalist. There'll be a job for me at a newspaper one day. So, despite the fact he went to study the thing he loved, he did not find university easy. He did not fit in with the others. He was not one of the frat boys, if you will. And he actually dropped out for a time and went to sell shoes with his dad, which is not something that he particularly enjoyed. In fact, it was kind of a reality check for Tennessee Williams, a reminder that he needed to go and pursue his passion for writing. So he returned to university. He finished his BA in 1938 as a 27-year-old. And then at this point, he embarked on a career in writing. Now, what does a career in writing look like? Yeah, it's hard work and writers struggle. We know this. It's very hard to break into the industry. And Tennessee Williams's trajectory was, yeah, exactly that. He had to work a number of really low wage, kind of menial jobs in order to sort of fund his writing, to give him the kind of money he needed to pursue his passion. And even then, the plays that he wrote were pretty poorly received initially. So a lot of writers would have been discouraged and probably given up at this point, but not Tennessee Williams. He kind of pursued it and he kept going. Now, he did move to New Orleans, which is the setting of A Streetcar Named Desire, by the way, and probably makes sense that he went here. This is a kind of more open-minded, more progressive American city, especially in the South, and it was a place full of creators. We know there was a flourishing jazz music scene there, and Tennessee went to pursue a career in writing for film, although he would obviously find his true calling in writing plays. Now, there's a bit of a subplot that's quite relevant here, and that's to do with Tennessee Williams' sister, Rose. Now, Rose was an incredibly troubled young woman, and she was kind of in and out of mental health facilities. And this kind of led to her eventually being committed to a psychiatric hospital where she was kind of given treatment, which we would just kind of shake our head at today. And the treatment that she eventually got was a lobotomy, which is essentially an operation on your brain where they try to cut out part of your brain in the hopes that they can eliminate the thing in your brain that's causing the mental health issues that you're dealing with in the first instance. And yeah, this did not work at all. In fact, it basically just left Rose kind of nothing. She was essentially no longer human after the operation, and there's a lot of guilt and ill feeling on Tennessee Williams's part about what happened to Rose, and we'll get into why that's significant a little bit later on. So, despite what's kind of happening in his familial life with his sister, Tennessee continues to write. And in 1945, aged 34, he finally makes it. He writes a play called The Glass Menagerie, which is still a really well known play, very famous piece of dramatic theatre. And this is a success and phew, relief. He's made it in the career path that he's pursued. He's finally getting there. Now, he follows this up in 1947, 2 years later, with A Streetcar Named Desire, which is arguably his most famous play, and it becomes a massive hit. It is huge. So we then enter what we might call the peak years of his career. He is really successful for this decade. In fact, he wins the Pulitzer Prize, which is pretty much like the best prize for writing that you can get in America. Not once, but twice. He wins it in 1948 for A Streetcar Named Desire, and he again in 1955 for Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, which is another really famous play that he wrote. Now, it's kind of interesting, he went to New Orleans to write for film, but couldn't really make it there. But now that he wrote these successful plays, the film industry came calling, and they actually adapted Streetcar Named Desire into a absolute smash hit film starring Marlon Brando as Stanley, Vivian Leigh as Blanche, directed by Elia Kazan. It won 4 Oscars, and it's kind of one of the most famous films of its time, if not kind of one of the most famous Hollywood films, full stop. In fact, the performances in that film are still held up today as being amongst the best ever committed to screen. So yeah, I very much urge you to go and check that film out. If you're studying the play, it is spectacular. So during this period of success, Tennessee Williams kind of enjoys some success in his private life. That is, he falls in love with a guy called Frank Merlo, and he and Frank basically split their time between America and Europe. And it would kind of make sense that they went to Europe, where maybe things are a little bit easier as a gay couple, a little bit more accepting, a little bit more open-minded, as opposed to kind of America, particularly the American South, which, as we know, was not particularly kind to people who were considered different in this respect. So then we move into the later years of his career, and it's kind of important to note that Tennessee Williams was troubled in terms of addiction. He was alcoholic, he was addicted to drugs as well, and this, certainly impacted his life very negatively. And in 1963, Frank Merlo dies, and this causes a pretty deep depression for Williams, and worrying that he's going to fall into the same kind of fate that his sister Rose suffered, he's pretty proactive in trying to check himself into care facilities to try to avoid that same pathway. And during this kind of time, you can probably imagine that his writing was maybe not as sharp, not as spectacular as those peak years with Streetcar and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And this kind of wears him down as well, the fact that the success kind of drifted away from him and he sort of started to fade away from the public consciousness. And he dies age 71 through accidentally choking. And yeah, I know 71 might seem like a reasonable age, but he was gone too soon. And who knows what kind of work he might have produced in those later years had he not died in the circumstances in which he did. So yeah, that is the life and times of Tennessee Williams. So let's talk about why this matters. Okay, obviously, it's important to know about people, and Tennessee Williams is a fantastic writer, and it's great to know his backstory. But what could we actually do with this in an exam context? What are some key things that we could pluck out of his life and say, well, that's kind of significant? Well, let's just think about some things. Firstly, Tennessee Williams saw a great deal of domestic turmoil, addiction, madness, and violence. These are all major features of his plays. They say that writers write about what they know. Well, he knew about all of those things, perhaps more than any person should have to. Also, consider the fact that as a gay man, he understood what it felt like to be othered. And by that, I mean to be trapped in a society that doesn't fully accept you, that positions you as being different, as being the other. He also would have understood as a gay man what it was like to feel desire for people, but maybe not to be able to act on that. And that's a significant kind of theme in A Streetcar Named Desire, hence the fact the word is in the title. Tennessee Williams would have understood those kind of unspoken feelings that can exist beneath the surface and the tension that can come from that. Finally, in this slide, the fact that he had a really close relationship with his mother and with his sister Rose meant that he knew and understood women, and he could write deeply emotionally complex female characters because he seemed to understand the female psyche certainly better than most. Okay, what else? Well, the fact he spent many years struggling, working kind of menial jobs for little pay, meant he understood working class men. And by this, I mean he understood people like Stanley, the guys in society who are struggling to get by, they're working hard to get ahead. He would have been around a lot of dudes like that, hence the reason he's able to write convincing characters like Stanley as well. Now, the whole subplot with Rose, where he basically watched his sister descend into madness and the kind of guilt that he felt for this, certainly must have played some part in his writing of Blanche. I mean, if you think about what happens to Blanche at the end of the play, it's pretty significant, and her sort of descent into madness might be something that he kind of observed himself, sadly. Addiction, okay, particularly to alcohol, it's a major feature in his plays. A lot of his characters, including somebody like Blanche, is alcoholic. And yeah, I mean, Tennessee Williams spent a lot of time around alcoholics. His father, he was an alcoholic himself. He understood addiction and the kind of escape that people try to find in drinking. And yeah, that's a kind of sad aspect of his life as well. And also consider the fact, which I mentioned earlier, that he was from the South. So he wrote a lot of plays set in the South. He understood what the American South was. He understood figures like the Southern Belle, who is obviously the kind of Blanche character that we see. And this becomes a pretty important aspect of his playwriting and adds to the sort of realism that we know is fundamental to his work. So, yeah, that is Tennessee Williams, his background, a bit of bio on him, and some consideration around how that actually informed the great pieces of writing that he left us with. As always, I am the lit teacher. If you like what I'm doing, please like my videos, subscribe to my channel, and I'll be back with some more Tennessee Williams and Streetcar Named Desire IGCSE content in the coming weeks and months. So please keep a lookout for that. Until next time, kakite. I'll see you later.